Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Hare Krishna. That's better. Some years ago, I don't exactly remember when, I wrote, or I was asked to write an article about the state of ISKCON, what my view of ISKCON was. That article was published in Mayapur magazine. So occasionally in Mayapur, they put out a new magazine, bring people up to date with what's happening there. And I was asked by the writers to provide some personal insights. So there's a lot of I in this. I did this, I saw that. Don't mind, it's not. It's just that the nature of the article called for me personally to express my observations and opinions about ISKCON. So this is definitely not Prabhupada purports, but it is about Srila Prabhupada's intrepid nature in spreading Krishna consciousness, and in particular with Mayapur, which of course is our international headquarters, so worldwide headquarters. So I'm going to read the article and maybe stop in different places and expand the meanings a bit more. Or maybe not. And then when we finish this, then we can do a questions and answers session. Although I've noted in the last couple of days that when I ask, is there any questions, nobody puts their hands up. Anyway, let's see what we can do. All right, so this is an article written by myself, probably about 6 or 8 years ago. It doesn't have a date on it now. So, but I think a lot of what's in there is still applicable now. So it's the name of the article is "In Prabhupada We Trust," because in America they have that on the dollar bills. In God we trust. So we say in God's representative we trust. Yeah. So I've always done a bit of traveling, at least since 1975, when I was fortunate enough to join Prabhupada's personal entourage. I got to travel India and around the world with His Divine Grace, and it gave me my first look at worldwide ISKCON. So I was impressed with Srila Prabhupada and impressed with his disciples, and the amazing scope of transcendental activity that was manifesting all over the globe. Unity was the key, and that was achieved through the presence and the desire of Srila Prabhupada. So as long as Prabhupada was on the planet, there was a lot of, let's say that there was not a lot of problems. I mean, problems were there, but Prabhupada was there to immediately solve them, so we didn't have very much difficulty in that respect. What happened after Prabhupada's disappearance, of course, was the key issue. So unity was the key, and that was achieved through the presence and desire of Srila Prabhupada. Later, after His Divine Grace's disappearance, I served as GBC in Australia for over 7 years. So it seems like I was in the air more often than on the road more often than I wasn't. So we were very kind of active. I was traveling every week to another city. I had Indonesia, New Zealand, and Australia. So there's about 17 centres at that time. So that was the life of a GBC. You had to travel. Prabhupada set that out early on in the scheme of management. In 1970, he formed the GBC officially and gradually empowered them to take over the full running of ISKCON and just generally oversee things that they were up to the proper spiritual standards. So a lot of things that he personally had overseen in the past, he was now beginning to delegate to his sannyasis and GBC man. So after Prabhupada's disappearance, of course, it was a different dynamic, and we had, some problems in figuring out how to keep things going without Prabhupada physically being there. We had problems with manpower sometimes, and there were a lot of things that I guess were stored within the heart of certain devotees that were checked from coming out when Prabhupada was there. But after Prabhupada left, then, it was like a swelling of, I wouldn't say non-devotional activities, but at least there was some agitation in various ways. So that was a tough call to keep the society together after Prabhupada left. I'm sure at least that I didn't feel qualified to be doing what I was doing. Prabhupada had made me the GBC in Australia and New Zealand, I guess April of 1977, so I only had a few months training up to when Prabhupada disappeared in November, and I was expected now to give direction for a vast, far-flung kind of geographical mass. Indonesia, Australia, New Zealand, etc. So we did our best. A lot of things that we did turned out to be not very beneficial. We made mistakes, but the one thing that kept us all together and stopped ISKCON from completely fragmenting was the order that Prabhupada gave in his will when he had returned to Vrindavan in May of 1977. Then he had his secretary, Tamal Krishna Maharaj, and some of the other GBCs draft a will, last will and testament, just to give some shape and to keep that shape of ISKCON. So the GBC, of course, were named by Prabhupada as his successors in the sense of the management of ISKCON. There were a lot of things that we didn't do very well, but there were a lot of things that we did. So this is some years later. Somebody asked me, how do you think ISKCON is going now? And so this is my observation. So I had a far-flung, what's happening here? I had a far-flung South Sea zone and international duties to fulfill. It was a boom time. We went from, in Australia at least, we went from 4 temples to 17 centres, including 3 farms, 2 schools, and additional restaurants and 2 new BBT divisions. So there was a lot of expansion going on at that time. From 95 full-time devotees, I did a census when Prabhupada sent me back to Australia as the GBC. The first thing I did was do a head count, try to understand how many devotees we've got and where they are. So there were at that time about 95 full-time ISKCON devotees. So from 1977 to about 1984, we jumped from 95 devotees to over 400 living in the temples. So we had, a boom time. I know that there were many divisions or other zones in ISKCON that were not doing so well after Prabhupada left, but somehow or another Krishna spared the Australian zone, the worst of all of that, maybe because we were down under. Nobody paid any attention, so we were doing okay, and things grew very rapidly. So it was a time of rapid expansion, and it seemed for a short while that we could do no wrong. Of course, human frailty was not far behind, and mundane realities exerted themselves individually and collectively. Maintaining what Prabhupada had left us proved to be a difficult task. So, the spiritual waves of preaching Shakti emanating from Prabhupada's personal presence, which had swept us along almost effortlessly, was like a great tsunami surging around the globe, but it subsided. After 1984, I personally left management and became an ISKCON private citizen. So I had some problems. I'd taken sannyas at an early age in 1980. Was it 80? No. Yes, I think 1980. But I only lasted about 3 or 4 years and realized that this was not the ashram I was meant to be in. We were talking about that this morning, with the elephant and the crocodile. So, we were enthusiastic to do things, and we saw Prabhupada was our only exemplar, the person that we were following. But there's a difference between following and copying, imitation. And I think a few of us fell for that we were trying hard, but we were not as advanced as what we should have been to be doing what we were doing. So it was a rough time for about 6 or 7 years. Lots of disruptions, people leaving, but somehow or another we kept everything basically together. So it was a little difficult, but Prabhupada's orders saved us. Yeah, we saw on the slideshow last night the will of Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, that there should be a governing body of 10 to 12 persons. So Prabhupada incorporated that instruction into his will, and that's actually what saved us. Yeah, otherwise I think within a year or two of Prabhupada's leaving, many things would have just simply collapsed. So because we had that order that the GBC was the ultimate managing authority, we were able to keep things together, not without loss. There were lots of devotees that were there, because Prabhupada was, available. And after Prabhupada left, then I think a lot of devotees felt this kind of emptiness and, kind of drifted away in for different reasons. But we had some difficulties, there's no doubt about that. But somehow or another we were going on. So after I left the management, I was much more stationary. I travelled a bit, but nothing like on the scale of my earlier years. I lived in England, then India, then Australia, then the USA, and finally back to India for the last 9 years now. So this article, I think, was written about 2008 or something like that. I didn't write the date on the file, but anyway. So in the last 3 years, I've resumed a bit of traveling again, delivering a seminar series entitled Srila Prabhupada, the Living Bhagavatam. So that means this article was written in 2008, because I started traveling again in 2005. So that was when I started with this series of seminars, Srila Prabhupada, the Living Bhagavatam. If we get my computer working, I might be able to retrieve that information. Right now we haven't. So I visited Brazil, USA, England, and several countries in the old Eastern European areas like Croatia, Slovenia, Ukraine, Poland, Russia, Latvia, and Lithuania. So for me it was a good time. I got the chance to travel all over the world and observe ISKCON in various states of, development or disintegration. But it gave me a good overview of what was happening all around the world with the ISKCON movement. So people sometimes ask me what Srila Prabhupada would think of the current condition of ISKCON. Having travelled with Prabhupada throughout the ISKCON world, when it was, by some criteria, at its peak in the West, I suppose they think that I have some kind of special insight into how Srila Prabhupada views it now. It's a common question, what do you think about ISKCON now, compared to what it was when you were travelling with Prabhupada? So, I suppose they think that I have some kind of special insight into how Prabhupada views things now. I wish I had. I don't. I'm not Prabhupada, and I'm the same as everybody else. So what criteria do I make such a judgment? Certainly I had no idea of Srila Prabhupada's view of the world. If I had, I would have been obviously a Mahabhagwat, because nobody else could understand what Prabhupada was doing, even his own godbrothers. But, he was doing something magical. And so it wasn't possible for us to understand the way that Prabhupada was thinking. We were just there to execute his instructions. So even if I had been a Mahabhagwat, how could I make an assessment of what that means? I remember sitting with His Divine Grace in his rooms in Bombay on January the 6th, 1977. He told me, you should always remember that you have taken a very, very difficult task. Prabhupada knew what was required, and he knew our immaturity, so it was going to be, a tough task. Manusyanam sahasreshu kaschid yatati siddhaye. It is not a very easy task. But one thing is sure, that if you be successful or not successful, that is your victory. This is Prabhupada telling us. Just try. You may not be qualified, but just make the effort to please Krishna. That's the success. We don't count success necessarily as how many big buildings we've got, how many devotees we've got, how many books that we sell, or whatever else. The main thing is that we were sincere and keen to, execute Prabhupada's desire. So we were maybe successful sometimes, and sometimes we weren't. So Prabhupada continues on. He says that I went to your country not to become successful. Prabhupada, that's a powerful statement. I went there not with the idea of becoming successful, but whatever Krishna provided, that was, what Prabhupada was working on. So one thing is for sure, if you're successful or not successful, it is your victory. Because you tried for this, Krishna will be very much pleased. It's not that in every case you will be successful. This is not possible. I went to your country not to be successful. That Bengali poem that I wrote, I never went there to become successful. I knew, who will accept this philosophy? Still, let me try, my Guru Maharaj has said. On another occasion, in Mayapur in 1977, just before Prabhupada became seriously ill, I had a conversation with him, and he told me that I want to spread Krishna consciousness everywhere at once. So that was Prabhupada's ambition. He was just starting to get seriously ill at that time. We just arrived back in Mayapur in mid-February of 1977. And, this particular occasion, Prabhupada had just come out of the bathroom. He was standing on the veranda of the Lotus building where his rooms were. I was next to him, and that was what he told me, that I want to spread Krishna consciousness everywhere at once. So he had that sense of urgency. The things had to be done immediately because he knew he didn't have much longer left in the material world. But that was his driving force. So on the one hand, anything that established Krishna consciousness was a success because none was expected. And on the other hand, no amount of expansion could match the pure devotee's ambitions. So, both ways. So still there must be some measure by which we can understand if we are doing things to Prabhupada's satisfaction or not. We had to have some kind of evaluation there. So there are myriad reasons, and my assessment can only be subjective. The way I see things, not necessarily the way that other devotees see it. So whatever I say, I pray that my reader will understand that this is just one man's observation, telescoped through the very limited lens of a conditioned soul's coverings. So that's my frailty, but anyway, since I was asked to give some opinion, then I tried. So I suppose the best criteria for making such a judgment is that set by Srila Prabhupada himself, the one that we most often quote, that your love for me will be shown how well you cooperate together. Everybody's heard that. Or at least that's the loose rendition. It's not actually exactly what Prabhupada said. The sentimental one, this is the sentimental one that we like to refer to when we want to engage or encourage each other, whether we're in or out of ISKCON, to respect each other and participate together in devotional activities. So, if your love will be shown by how well you cooperate together, except that that's not exactly what Prabhupada actually said. The actual quote is much more specific, and that makes it much more typical of Srila Prabhupada. Prabhupada did sometimes give general, instructions, but most of the time he was very clear about objectives and how to reach them. So that phrase it's been bandied about the whole movement ever since. Your love for me will be tested. So what Prabhupada actually said was that your love for me will be tested how after my departure you maintain this institution. So it wasn't just that how well you cooperate together, it was very specific that how well you maintain this institution, that will show your genuineness as devotees. So we have glamour, Prabhupada said, and people are feeling our weight. So this should be maintained, not like in our Gaudiya Mat. After Guru Maharaj's departure, so many acharyas came up, and that's a comment from TKG's diary to Krishna Maharaj. So Prabhupada was very precise in stating his criteria. If we love him and not ourselves, then we will work cooperatively to maintain the specific powerful entity that he had set up, namely the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, ISKCON. And just to emphasize what that meant, he gave a negative example for us to compare ourselves with, the Gaudiya Mat, which lost its unity and became fragmented by so many independent acharyas. So Prabhupada had that on his mind. He went through he observed the disintegration of his godbrothers' temples. They were all splitting apart, people were fighting, court cases were going on, and the whole preaching impetus that Bhaktivedanta Saraswati had set up was lost. So Prabhupada was very keen to see that not happened to ISKCON. He was very concerned about that. So that was the example that he used. I want you to work together to maintain this institution, not like my godbrothers. Yeah, he expected something better from us than that. So by this criteria, at least we can say that ISKCON, good or bad, continues to exist. Yeah, we didn't fragment. We had a few people fragmenting, but not so many. Wherever one goes around the world, there are ISKCON devotees who are eager to receive you and to offer their services and to eagerly hear and chant with you and to take prasadam with. For sure, many centers are depleted from their original levels of attendance and occupation, but then again, the number of centers that we have has now more than tripled since the time of Srila Prabhupada, and unimaginable events have occurred in places where during this time it was a criminal offense to simply possess a Bhagavad Gita. I think I missed something out there. No, sorry, that's right. So what was the unimaginable events? That was, Eastern Europe. The Iron Curtain coming down in 1990, and then all the Eastern European countries were getting their independence, which gave ISKCON a chance to move in and set up, and which we've done quite successfully. I sometimes go to the Ukraine Summer Festival. There's 8,000 to 10,000 devotees there. None of them are Indians. In India, everybody's naturally familiar with the culture. And to some extent, it's like what they call preaching to the choir. Yeah, when you have a church, you have a choir. So the choir, they sit inside the church, they lead all the singing. So it's not to be expected that you have to sit them down and try and convince them to be, a Christian or whatever. So hence that phrase, preaching to the choir. It means that there are people that are already interested, they're already practicing. If you preach to them, it's not so difficult. Yeah, but if there's no if there's no presence of ISKCON, then it's a lot harder to get things up and running. So at least Prabhupada, anyway, I think would have been extremely happy that the work that he did, that one visit that we discussed with Ananta Shanti, turned into a mass movement in areas of the world where it was a criminal offense to possess a spiritual book. Yeah. If you read Shamasundar's latest offering, the second volume of his Chasing Rhinos book, that gives the description of when Prabhupada went to Moscow. And when they arrived at the airport from India, the authorities opened up the suitcases to see that there was no contraband or illegal things there. And right there on the top of Prabhupada's suitcase was a Bhagavad Gita. And I think Shyamasundar said that his wife Malati, without telling him, she had slipped this Bhagavad Gita into the luggage. So when they got to Moscow and the police opened it up, there's a forbidden book that could have probably got them arrested. But, they talked for 5 minutes and they said, all right, no harm. So they gave him the book. Prabhupada was in, and that was the end of the Soviet Union. That one Bhagavad Gita, that one occurrence of, slipping it in unnoticed. So anyway, so in 2005, I traveled around the world with my wife and my daughter and a friend of hers. It was not an easy task, but it was made a great pleasure by the wonderful hospitality extended to us wherever we went. Selfless devotees turned over their homes to us, fed us, and catered to all our needs. Add to this the generous hospitality from temple managers in places like Honolulu, London, Belgium, Milan, and Rome. We had an exceptionally good time, sheltered and cared for by the Kalpavriksha of ISKCON. Apart from this, I did a 2-month preaching tour of several countries in Eastern Europe. So we had a very good experience. We're just a family, and wherever we went, immediately devotees were, eager to help and serve out, provide food and lodging, So it was a wonderful spirit that was still there. So, as I mentioned, after a couple of months, then I did this preaching tour in Eastern Europe. So everywhere I went, I was received with generosity, gentility, and genuine friendship. Hundreds of devotees were eager to hear about Srila Prabhupada for as long as I could talk to them. So there was a real thirst and excitement amongst the devotees to know more and more details about the life of our founder Acharya, Srila Prabhupada. It's a healthy sign and a great encouragement for the future. Local cultural traits notwithstanding, Krishna consciousness has taken root all over the world. The culture of spirituality, the lifestyle of bhakti, the characteristics of real transcendentalism have been irrevocably implanted in the most unlikely places, all through the aegis of that singular entity, ISKCON. It is undeniable that Srila Prabhupada's brainchild has made and continues to make a lasting impact on the world. So what Prabhupada set up in the form of ISKCON has grown and grown. Now, because this was written 10 years ago, but nowadays they say there's over about nearly 800 ISKCON centers. So things are expanding. When Prabhupada was with us just in the last couple of weeks, he told us several times that don't spoil everything, at least maintain what I've given you. That will be enough. Even if you can't do anything else, maintain what's already been provided. So we've done much more than maintain, obviously. It's undeniable that Prabhupada's brainchild has made and continues to make a lasting impact on the world. Of course, not everyone has the same experience as me. I received a letter just a few weeks ago from a godbrother who has been estranged from mainstream ISKCON for some years, and he expressed himself in no uncertain terms. He said, in all reality, when you're an older Prabhupada disciple who has not already made his mark in ISKCON, there is little hope for feeling comfortable amongst the leadership. So he was feeling a bit, offside. You were kind to put under an emotional pen. You were kind of put in an emotional penury and have very little support, associating with most big gatherings of ISKCON Illuminati for devotees like me is frankly depressing and humiliating. So, which is exactly why so many Prabhupada disciples are not coming back to the fold. First the fold has to fold, if you get my point. So he was complaining. I invited him to come to the festivals. I knew he'd been away for some years, struggling on his own. And I was trying to persuade him that ISKCON is actually booming. It's going on very well, very nice atmosphere, so many activities are going on. We'll surely find you something that you can do, useful for Prabhupada. But his estimate was that unless you were already well established and well known, then you don't get much attention, as an ordinary devotee. So he wasn't happy with that. So he went on, it may be hard for you to imagine what it's like for Prabhupada disciples like me, since you were so famous and appreciated in ISKCON. As a whole, your experience is totally different. So he was my old friend. He had he had joined in Vrindavan when the temple first opened in 1975. I was the temple commander, and he was one of the Sankirtan party people. So we were old friends. Later on we went and did some preaching in Bali, in Indonesia also. But then he drifted away. So he's saying that it's hard for you to imagine what it's like for somebody like me that doesn't have a position, and doesn't get the kind of treatment that you automatically take for granted. So on the whole, your experience is totally different. It's acknowledgement and support at every turn. So my only chance of that is when someone with some power, insight, knows my service like you. Such persons like that are just about non-existent for me in the ISKCON leadership now. So I was extending myself to him a little bit, but he was complaining that most leaders don't. You know, they live in a world of their own. Ivory tower is the English. You know, you're up there in the clouds, everybody else is, you know, ordinary people, but you think that everything is to your experience, but you're an unusual person, you're not typical in ISKCON. So that was his complaint. So, this is me speaking now. It would be foolish to deny such sentiments and leave them unaddressed. The leadership of ISKCON clearly has a lot of work to do to make the society a place where, to quote a well-known adage, the whole world can live. That was another statement attributed to Srila Prabhupada. There used to be this guy across the Jalangi River in Mayapur. What was his name? Mr. Roy, I think it was. He was like a psychic. People would queue up at his doors. What's going to happen with my business, or what's happening with my family, and he would have, you know, some comments to make. So I think Bhaktivedanta Prabhu went to see this man, and he showed him a picture of Prabhupada. And when he saw this picture of Prabhupada, he said, "This is, from his face, this is a person who can create a house in which all the world can live." So some of you may know that statement. That was from this Mr. Roy. So he had quoted that. Sorry, I lost the cursor. So ISKCON is by any measure a work in progress, and none of us would deny that, but it does exist. You know, sometimes we get people, I meet old God brothers and God sisters, ISKCON's not what it used to be. So then I ask them, well, which ISKCON are you talking about? The one in 26 2nd Avenue for, 1 year in New York, or the one that's spread to England and Europe, or the one that's here now in India, building so many big temples. Which ISKCON are you talking about? Yeah, if you want to make a comparison. So ISKCON is a very dynamic entity. It's always changing. Yeah, in 100 years' time, we'll still be discovering new things to do and new ways of doing it. That's the nature that Prabhupada set up for us. So, that kind of question, I don't think is well put. We can't say, that ISKCON is the same and should have remained the same as it was in 1966. That would be ludicrous. That means that all of Prabhupada's preaching would have been to no avail. ISKCON is growing, it's going to continue growing, and as it grows, there are new things and, considerations that have to be taken into account, and you have to adjust for that. So it's not really a valid complaint that ISKCON's not what it used to be. Of course it's not. It could never be, unless we just drop it and walk away, which we're not going to do. So, although fragmentation has occurred, and who amongst us thought that it would not, the main body of the society has held together. There is a unity and a determination to execute the desire of Srila Prabhupada that is tangible in countries all over the globe. As one senior God brother told me, you can say what you like about ISKCON, but it's the only act in town. This was one of my older God brothers. He had left ISKCON and gone off with some Gaudiya Math personality. Then later on, he came to see me when I was in Calcutta. That was his comment. You can say, he was himself critical about ISKCON, and that was why he'd left. But he had to admit that the real fact is, he said, I can go to any Gaudiya Math and find a place to stay there. But he said, the fact is, that ISKCON is the only show in town. Yeah, nobody else bothers with the others. So at least he had to, admit that. So who else is putting on Rath Yatra in multiple cities around the globe? We have to look at the practical effect of what's happening in ISKCON's preaching. We have maybe 100 Rath Yatras all around the world every year now. I was in Malaysia some years back, and they told me that actually, I went to the Rath Yatra, and they told me that actually we have a Rath Yatra almost every week. We're touring around Malaysia, so at least 35, 36 Rath Yatras are going on in just one small country in the world, what to speak about the rest of the world. So that's a credit. Prabhupada wanted Rath Yatra to be one of the main festivals, that he introduced into ISKCON. He had done it as a child, and he knew the potency of it. And it's not a coincidence that when the devotees first arrived in 1967 in San Francisco, or when Prabhupada first arrived there and devotees started coming, one of the first things that happened was that Malati, Shamasundar's wife, she had gone shopping, and there was a cost plus shop. They imported things from India, and she happened to see this little wooden doll, I think painted black. That was Lord Krishna, and she was immediately attracted to these little wooden figures. So as she went out, she grabbed one and put it in her pocket. She didn't pay for it. Those days, they didn't have any money, so she just slipped it in her pocket and walked out. When she got back to where Prabhupada was staying, then she pulled him out. She asked Prabhupada, "What's this, Swamiji?" Prabhupada immediately got down and offered his obeisances. And then he asked her, are there any more? So she said, "I don't know, I can go back." So Prabhupada said, "Yeah, do that." So she went back, she saw that there was a white one and a yellow one, Balaram and Subhadra. She brought them back, same method. And Prabhupada immediately, he had them make like a little altar. And the first thing that he did, the main thing that he did in San Francisco in 1967 was establish Rath Yatra. Even they didn't have a Rath cart, they just hired a truck. But Lord Jagannath was there. So Lord Jagannath made his appearance right at the beginning of ISKCON's existence. Now Rath Yatra has become a huge event in so many different countries around the world. So who else is doing that? I don't know a single other organization that does Rath Yatra out in the streets, in the big cities, etc. ISKCON is doing that. So who else is distributing Srila Prabhupada's books on the streets and in the airport? Literature that was written and has the potency to change the whole world. We're the only ones that are doing that. ISKCON, that's one of the ISKCON standards, to distribute as many of Prabhupada's books as possible. Nobody else is doing that. They're not going out on the street. When I first joined in Sydney in 1972, that was our only occupation. For the first 3 years that I was in the movement, what we did day in, day out was go and chant and sell Prabhupada's books. And it wasn't easy. It was quite difficult, But we did it because Prabhupada wanted it, and that's what made us successful. So what other organization is doing that? Distributing Bhagavad Gita, Srimad Bhagavatams, etc. I saw on the internet a couple of nights ago a bulletin somebody had sent out. There's a group of devotees that sell, I think they're in Europe, or maybe America, but they sell a stack of Prabhupada's books, like a library, on the spot, on the street, to people that they just meet there.
One of them is here. He's in New York, they're distributing.
New York, yes, all right, that's you, huh? I mean, that's so unbelievable. When I joined, I mentioned that we were selling maybe 3 or 4 back to Godheads in a whole day, and we got 20 cents for each magazine. So we were coming back to the temple, our collection used to be about $2 or $3. We were 3 months behind with the rent, we had no money for the Sunday feast, so we used a lot of subjis and grains and ghee and whatever. We had no money to buy it, so we would jump in the van about 11 and 12 o'clock at night on a Saturday night, and we'd go to the local, what do you call them, people that grow crops. There's a market garden. We'd go to the local market gardeners, slip in at midnight, load up the truck with, different kinds of subjects, and then come back and serve that out for the Sunday feast. So, for at least a short time, things were a little tough, but we coped with it. Rath Yatra, we had the first one in Sydney Melbourne in 1972. So Bhaktivedanta Swami, he had just come from India, and Prabhupada met in the GBC in Australia. And he was originally from San Francisco. So he had worked with Jayananda Prabhu and others on building these three, magnificent chariots. You see the pictures of them even now. And so when he came to Australia to be the new GBC, he was actually the first GBC, the first thing that he did was introduce Rath Yatra. So we had no money. So we got a design from Bhaktivedanta and one of the girls who was an artist, and we started constructing. The first year we made one chariot for Subhadra. Later on that was used for Subhadra. But we had the one chariot, and everything on the chariot was stolen. I mean, we stole all the wood. We had a van, and the driver, Vijayaranya, he would come and see me every morning, and I'd have a list of wood that I needed, for the axle, for the tower, and then he'd go out all day and he'd scout out different building sites, because there was a lot of redevelopment going on in Sydney. So they were building big skyscraper buildings, and that meant that there was huge amounts of wood, on the building sites. So we used to sneak in the night and fill up the van, pick out which ones we wanted, go back and build the Rath cart. So we did that the first year, and the second year in 1973, we wanted to have 3 chariots, but we were in the same position, we had no money. So Vijayaranya went out in the van the first day, and he got caught. He drove into some building site pretending he was one of the workers. To do it successfully, you've got to act like you're there, you're supposed to be there. You're not like looking around or anything, you're very confident. You walk in and pretend you're one of the workers on the site. So Vijayaranya drove into this, work site, construction site, opened up the doors and started loading in, the kind of wood that we needed. And it turned out the owner was there at the gate. So he got caught. And then fortunately the man was, kind of easygoing. And when they told him what it was for, he said, "All right, but don't come back for any more." It was a dilemma for us when we found out that he got caught. That was an apprehension. Should we be doing this? If we don't, maybe we should stick to the minute budget that we've got and, not get caught by the cops. But after discussion, we decided that the options that we had was simply to have the one chariot or to have 3 chariots. And if we, what that meant was that if we wanted to have the 3 chariots at least, and the small one was already made, then there was only one option open to us, and that was to, go out with the vans in the night and come back with the wood. So some people were saying it was Krishna's arrangement that they got caught on the first day because it's wrong to do this, and Krishna is showing us that we shouldn't, be stealing the wood for the Rath cart. And then other devotees were saying, no, this is a test from Krishna. We need the money. We want to have the Rath Yatra parade is for the benefit of, all the conditioned souls. So this is just Krishna testing us to see if we're sincere about, having the Rath Yatra or not. So we did it, again we went out. I remember the last night, the last load of wood that we had to collect. I hated going out and doing it. It would, you get pumped full of adrenaline, and you were always, afraid that you were going to get caught. So for me, it was a bit extreme, but I did it because we had to. So I hired a 4-ton truck, and, I pulled up behind one of the building sites, which was not very far from the temple either. And I spent about an hour crawling around, looking at the wood, finding out, the right sizes and, thicknesses and whatever. I had the hired truck. What we did was there was a wire fence, so we cut the wire back so we could get the wood out. I had the vehicle parked in the back lane. On the other side of the lane were all residences and houses. And we, loaded it up, myself and another devotee. And when we got everything we wanted, we closed the gap on the fence. And just as we got in the truck to drive off, some of the neighbors heard something, so they came out looking. But fortunately, we were able to drive away without being stopped. And of course, the streets were deserted. It was about 11 o'clock at night. And so there was a risk, if the police patrols were out. We were in this van. We had a couple of pieces of wood that were 24 feet long. So when we put them in the van, the end of them would bang on the road as we were driving along. We sat on the wood to keep it, from falling out the back. I don't think I could do anything like that nowadays. So that's how we built the first Rath Yatras. And then we had to decorate them, right? So we had no money to buy the flowers. So the same team, they went out. There's a place called Franklin where, these guys were growing huge glass houses full of gardenias and really expensive flowers. And there was one place where there was about 8 or 9 of these glass houses, and they were big, huge things, not like small, bigger, 2-3 times as big as this room, and filled with, flowers that they were selling, making their livelihood from it by selling them in the markets. So the devotees snuck into one of those greenhouses, and they just wiped the whole place. And they had about 10 plastic dustbin bags. They just filled them up. There was nothing left in the greenhouse. And they came back. They dumped all the flowers on the ground, and then the girls began to make garlands. So the next morning was Rath Yatra Day, and I was busy nailing up, the garlands that the girls had made. And then I noticed there was a couple of policemen looking at us, and there was a guy with them in these rubber boots that come up to your knees. He was the farmer. And so they came over and they demanded to know, where do you get these flowers from? They belong to this man, so we have to confiscate them. And we want to know who did it. And if you don't tell us, we're going to stop this parade and make sure that it never happens. So one of our devotees, Samendranath, he overheard the conversation. So he walked up to the police and he asked them, is something wrong? And then the police, of course, told him, some of you people have been stealing all this man's flowers. So he said, oh no, he said, I did it on my own. So I went out in the van. I wanted to do something to decorate the chariots with, so I went on my own. So the police had their man. Actually, Samendranath was not on the collection party, let's call it. He was with me, actually, painting the Rath cart at midnight, trying to get it all ready. So anyway, as long as the cops got one man, they were happy. So they took the flowers as evidence. They took Samendranath. He spent Rathayatra in jail. And we went on with the parade. But that was it. You know, they got him. They took him to court. And by that time, actually what the cops did was they got him to sign a confession. But they told him what he had to write. So, you know, his so-called confession was actually made by the police, and they just got him to sign it that, yes, I snuck into the greenhouses, I lifted the latch like this, I went inside with my plastic bags, filled them up, whatever. So he got fined, and he got sentenced to 1 month in jail, and what else? He had to pay restitution to the farmer. So those flowers were worth about $1,800, which was a huge amount of money in those days. So we appealed. In the meantime, he was out on bail. And with the appeal, it went to the judge that was in charge. It was known to be very liberal, so our lawyer, he arranged it so that, you know, that guy would be the prosecutor or the judge. And because he knew that it was more than likely that he wouldn't do anything, even if he found us guilty. And that's what happened. We had the trial, and we had one barrister as our defender, and they listened to all the, tale of what happened. And then the magistrate, he said, all right, he said, on the evidence that's been presented, I have to find you guilty. But he said, you're a monk, so where are you going to get the money from to pay back the farmer? So he said, although he left that as part of the punishment, he himself said, I don't suppose you'll ever pay this anyway because you're a monk. And as far as the other charges, he said, you don't have any criminal record, so I'm striking out the 1 month in jail. Like that. So somehow or other Krishna arranged it that Samendranath got off scot-free. He didn't have to pay the fine, he didn't have to pay for the restitution, etc. So later on, Prabhupada came to Australia, and that story was told to him. So he told us, no more. Don't steal any more flowers. So we did some pretty radical things in the early days. We were, trying our best, and whatever facility that came to us, we were using it and doing it for Krishna. So Prabhupada wasn't too angry. But in Sydney also we had the same thing. We went into one of the local parks, and we just wiped out every flower that was in the public park and took it back to the temple. It was for some festival. So that was our standard for a while. After Samendranath episode, then we decided, all right, we can't do this anymore. It'll give us a bad reputation. Anyway, so that putting on Rathayatras, now we have hundreds of Rathayatras every year. And so many thousands and tens of thousands of people see them. They get prasadam. Just by seeing the Lord on the Rath Kite, you get liberation. Prabhupada was very, very keen on, having Rathayatra go on in every city in the world. So who else is doing that? That's my point, is that nobody else is doing that except ISKCON. So when I wrote this overview or opinion, it was based on, what was actually happening. So same with the literature, we had to go to jail many times for selling books on the street. There were so many difficulties that we met when we first started, but somehow or another, by Prabhupada's mercy and by his constant pushing us to go out and preach, magical things were happening. So, let's see. Again, who else is putting on festivals like the Odessa gathering in Ukraine or Anapa in Russia, where 1,500 or to 2,500 devotees come to the summer festival to dance, chant, and hear with great eagerness from a host of senior Vaishnavas. If anybody of you can travel to Europe, I advise you to go to the Ukraine festival. There's like 8,000 or 10,000 devotees that attend that. And the same in Russia, 4,000 or 5,000 devotees come for their summer festival. I mean, we could never have dreamed of that in Prabhupada's time, to get into the Soviet Union, and make so many devotees. So who else has temples like Juhu or Vrindavan or Mayapur or Bhaktivedanta Manor in England that regularly host hundreds of thousands of pilgrims on major festival days? Nobody's doing that except ISKCON. And who else has hundreds of centers all around the world where any devotee can be received in friendship with a place to stay and prasadam to eat? So there's many, many functions that the devotees are doing, all under Prabhupada's aegis. It's what we were talking yesterday, that all of the things that we're doing in ISKCON, these are all things that Prabhupada himself did, either when he was a small child or later on, when he finished with his, or even during his business life. He was producing Back to Godhead magazine. And when he retired, then he started, work on his Bhagavatam. Nobody else is doing that. None of his godbrothers did it. Only Prabhupada, so very unique. So ISKCON is a very transcendental product of Prabhupada's determination to preach Krishna consciousness all over the world. He was very fixed on that. So the list is a long one. Whenever I travel, I meet dedicated, sincere souls who are working hard to maintain Srila Prabhupada's society. They are inspired by his personal example and by the words in his books, and by the determination of his disciples and grand disciples to preserve his work and not lay to waste his lifetime of effort. Prabhupada, got his whole life to... Satsvarup Maharaj calls that volume of the Leela Amrita, a lifetime in preparation. And that's what it was. Everything Prabhupada was doing was preparing him for what Krishna wanted him to do in the end, the fag end of his life. So very wonderful, how ISKCON was developed. And it's all Prabhupada. So it's a tribute to his brilliance that in the midst of Kali Yuga, when it is far easier to find fault and flake away, that his transcendental creation ISKCON has held together and continues to provide spiritual succor to the distressed and spiritually bereft. And it is also a tribute to his sincere followers that despite the potential for disagreement and dissent, and despite the deficiencies of ourselves personally and collectively, that they continue working together with hope and confidence. This is love. In January 1976, Prabhupada wrote a letter to Burijan Das, and he says in that letter, "Unless there is a loving feeling, how is it possible for you to always make offerings to me? The spiritual master is always instructing his disciples, and they in turn are always trying to serve the spiritual master. So it's a reciprocal relationship of love." So Prabhupada recognized that this is actually love. I was giving a seminar in Vrindavan some years back. Tamal Krishna Maharaj was there, and I mentioned, how all the things that were going on or, manifest in ISKCON was due to our love for Prabhupada. So he kind of shook his head a little bit, because his interpretation of love, he'd been teaching a course on Brahma Samhita, and his interpretation of love, that's the highest level of attainment in Krishna consciousness, Krishna Prem. So we can't claim that we're on the level of Krishna Prem. So he wasn't really agreeable to my comment that we did everything out of love. But actually, there's different levels of love. when a child who's very, completely immature says, I love you, Mummy, or I love you, Daddy, that's still love. It may not be a realized love, yeah. It may not be on the topmost level, but it is love. And that's, that was our motivation for pleasing, for preaching Krishna consciousness, was our love for Prabhupada. If we didn't have that love, as he says, then what would we be doing? We would leave. So we have to have an atmosphere of appreciation amongst all the devotees. And in that way, we'll get Prabhupada's blessings, Krishna's blessings, things will continue to flourish. But if we fall out, if we argue and fight, then the opposite result will be there, that Prabhupada's work will be damaged. Our own spiritual lives will be damaged. So the highest principle that I've been personally brought to understand by my experiences is that we have to do things selflessly, we have to do things out of love, and we have to cooperate. That love is exhibited by the mood of cooperation, and without that cooperation we don't have a transcendental society. So it's very important that we keep that at the forefront of everything that we do. So on a morning walk, on August the 11th, 1976, when Prabhupada was visiting Tehran. At that time, Americans and Europeans were, welcomed into Iran. And we had a few devotees there that were doing amazing preaching. There's one sannyasi, about 4 grihasta couples, and 1 brahmachari. But that sannyasi, his name was Paramahamsa Swami. He had been a teacher of Hatha Yoga before he joined the temple. He was a young guy, about 25 or something like that. And somehow or another, like to preach in Tehran, he set up some shop or place, like a hall, where he was teaching Hatha Yoga. So one of the relatives of the Shah of Iran, her nephew, he'd had trouble with drugs. So he came to Paramahamsa's yoga center and kind of basically got himself together. He stopped taking drugs, started doing yoga, and it was a big improvement. So his mother, she also started coming. So because the royal family, they're not supposed to mingle with the common folk. So she had Paramahamsa Swami coming up to the main palace and going inside the ladies' quarters where no man is allowed. And he was teaching her yoga. And they said that he was the first white man, first Caucasian, to ever go into the inner chambers of the Shah of Iran. So it was an amazing, thing that was going on there. So on one morning walk anyway, Prabhupada was telling us about passing a test. That phrase was there, that your love for me will be tested, how after my departure you maintain this institution. So Tamal Krishna Maharaj had recorded that in his diary in 1977. So whilst he was doing that, Prabhupada in 1976, he was telling us when he was in Tehran, he said, to be recognized by Krishna, as he says, Nachatas man manusheshu, then one has to pass an examination, a severe test of examination. A bit strong, but that's what Prabhupada told us, you have to pass this severe test of examination. All the big devotees we see, Narada Muni, before he became Narada Muni, he had to pass through a severe examination. So test faith means that you were meant for giving some service to Krishna. You stick to that service, that path, in spite of all impediments. This is the passing of the test. So it's not generally just like we are meant for preaching Krishna consciousness. So there may be a severe test, but still we will remain determined that is wanted. There may be so many impediments and punishments, still you should do that. This is the test. Not that as soon as there's some difficulty, I give it up. There may be a severe test, but still we shall not give up. We must go on. That is determination. Passing the test means executing the order of the spiritual master. So one of the devotees, Navayovana, he was one of the Grihastha men. So he said that, and Prabhupada agreed. He said, yes, this is spiritual life. One has to take order from the spiritual master and execute it, despite all impediments. That is determination. So my question was, do we pass that test? I've been asked to write an article, the state of ISKCON, or the way that I saw it. So that was my conclusion. We should ask, if you want to know what state ISKCON is in, then you have to ask, are we passing this test? So from this fallen soul's perspectives and experience, I think so. We may not get 100%, but at least a pass, passing mark. So ISKCON continues on as a united preaching force, and as long as it does, that is the passing of the test of our love for Srila Prabhupada that he personally set for us. So that's my assessment, and that was written 10 years ago, I think, but I would stick with the same observations, and probably even have a more optimistic look at view of ISKCON than they had at that time. We've been through some periods of tremendous turmoil with different people getting us into trouble by their nonsense activities. But we're here, we're still here, and growing like anything. That's one of the most inspiring aspects, I think, for me, of ISKCON in India. When I first came to India in 1975, we had 2 or 3 temples, and everything was being run by the Westerners, practically. There were hardly any Indian men and women that had joined ISKCON at that time. So, all the Western devotees, they had to, try to figure out how to do things in a completely foreign environment. But they did it. And now, practically speaking, you hardly see any white devotees, Western devotees. Everything has been run by the local men, which is what Prabhupada wanted. When sometimes a temple president would complain that we don't have enough manpower, Prabhupada would tell them, well, I'm not sending you anybody, you have to go out and engage the local population. And that way then Krishna will be pleased and he'll send people to you. So Prabhupada wanted the local men to take responsibility. And it's worked, at least as far as I can see. I mean, there's so many big temples in India now. It's unbelievable. From Kanpur. I mean, we started off with Vrindavan. That was the first custom-built temple. And then there was Bombay immediately after that, Hyderabad the same year. So they were the main centers. But as time's gone by, now we see every city's got, a big ISKCON temple. I just showed the magazine that I got off the aeroplane coming here. And there was, a section on different places that you must see whilst you're here in Salem. And they listed different mundane places, and then they mentioned that there's this church and that temple, and then at the end of the column it said, and of course there's the famous Hare Krishna temple. This is in your local airline. They're advertising the famous, organization, ISKCON organization. So we're making an impression. And Prabhupada always told us, Caesar's wife should be beyond suspicion, which means now we've set something up nice, now you have to maintain it nicely. Don't spoil it by fighting or doing mischief. What we've got has been given by Krishna, and now we have to sustain it as much as we can, and if we can, develop more. That was Prabhupada's desire. So I told the devotees that actually I'd never heard of Salem till I think last year or something, when I got an invite. I had no idea what was here and what to expect, but this is wonderful. What you're doing here is, really special. So, it means that Prabhupada's blessings are there. We're passing the test, And ISKCON is continuing, not only maintaining, but growing like anything in many places. It's true that there are a few temples, maybe in America, that started off, they were big at the time. Now a lot of the American temples have become a bit depleted. But, you know, Europe's going on. Again, in Europe there were some places that had problems with the leaders leaving them, but gradually it's coming up. And India is, you know, the crown jewel. It's like the British Empire. You know, India was the place where they were getting all their riches and, you know, facility from. So now we're reversing that. You know, the British are not here anymore, and the Indians are taking over England. Yeah, the British Isles. You go anywhere, you go to Coventry, you go to Leicester, you go to London, it's filled with Indians. So that's good. But anyway, so we've got a lifetime's work to do. Don't think that this is the end. You do your little bit and then sit back. There's so many people out there that are suffering, so many people that need Krishna consciousness. And that was Prabhupada's real reason for going to the West, was to preach Krishna consciousness and save these Kali Yuga rascals from going to hell. Yeah, that was. Otherwise, he could have stayed in Vrindavan. He told me one time in Bombay, he was talking about the principle of utsahan, enthusiasm. So he said, without this utsahan, how could I have gone to the West to preach? I was living here in Vrindavan, everything was nice, but because I had this enthusiasm for fulfilling the desire of my spiritual master, therefore I left Vrindavan and went all over the world. So, you know, Prabhupada took risks, but his intention was very powerful, you know, to save us all from rotting in hell, going to hell. Yeah, become human beings at least, and transcend everything and go back home, back to Godhead. That was Prabhupada's intent. So, where's that drink? If anybody has any questions or comments. I was going to say, in the early days that I mentioned, when we had no money and manpower, and we were also getting harassed on the streets by the local city authorities. So many devotees, you know, they were put in the book, they then went to the magistrate, they were fined some amount of money, and we would just go on with our Sankirtan activities regardless of the cops and the local council. And sometimes they would come and raid the temple, and the police, because the system was that if you got booked for some offence, we wouldn't bother going to the court. So we'd go through the court system and we get fined $40 or $60, $100 or whatever it was. And then it was up to the local council to collect those fines. So we wouldn't pay them. We mostly didn't even know that we owed them, because we never went to the court. We were too busy out selling books. And after, you know, a while, the police would suddenly appear at the entrance to the temple, and about 6 o'clock in the morning, and they grab whoever they could, you know, the devotees, and haul them off to jail. So we had a system that we had a back alley. So normally we use the front entrance, but we had a back alley, and we would leave the van parked there, and then sometimes when the police came, they'd come in running in through the front door. Any devotee that had some fines to pay, they'd go running out the back, and they'd jump in the van and drive off to the local park, and then chant japa until, you know, an hour or so had gone by, and then go back to the temple and continue on. So there was all kinds of things going on in the early days, and we were getting booked regularly by the police, we were getting fined. Devotees, if they didn't pay the fine, then you had to spend 1 day in jail for every $40 that you owed. So if you owed $400 in fines and you didn't pay it, then they put you in the jail for 10 days. and then you pay off your fine that way. So quite a few devotees ended up in jail, and they would go on a fast. Yeah, they would refuse to eat. Then that came up in the newspapers. Hare Krishnas in the Pentridge jail, they're not taking any food, they're on a fast, a protest. So it gradually became an embarrassment for the city authorities. We continued on. We go out every day selling books on the main street. There was one gentleman who was the head council officer. Yeah, we used to call him Square Jaw, because he was a little fat guy and big jowls, so he looked like a block, So we used to call him Square Jaw. He'd get really angry, and he would book us. And he used to come with the police to the temple, and he was such a fanatic that he knew the name, the spiritual name and the legal name of every devotee. And he knew how many fines we owed, and every now and again he would get the police to come with him and arrest whoever was, So we had a lot of fun running around, chasing around with Square Jaw. So that went on for a number of years, then eventually retired. Now in Melbourne, we have a couple of restaurants on the main street. One's Gopal's, and that was like a paying restaurant. And we have another one which is like $5 all you can eat, cheapo, and that's called Crossroads. So one of the devotees, they went into the Crossroads, got some prasadam, and he looked across and there's this man, Square Jaw. He's sitting in the Hare Krishna restaurant enjoying prasadam. And he was the fanatic that was arresting us, and now he's there eating prasadam. So I think somebody went up to him and said, "Hey, are you Square Jaw?" He put his head down. He said, "That was just my job." He said, "I'm not working anymore now." But it was nice. So I think that, he was so fixated on getting the Hare Krishnas off the street, stopping us selling books and everything. He was chanting Krishna's names all day. I'm sure it must have been at night time too, because he was so obsessed. He knew all the devotees' names, and so he was automatically chanting Krishna's names and getting purified. So all's well that ends well, as they say. So we had, there were a lot of things going on in the early days. We had a tax on the temple. One night, about 11 o'clock, I was up on the first floor. We'd taken rest, and I heard this sound of breaking glass. I ran down the stairs, and I saw that somebody had thrown a Molotov cocktail at the front door. You know what a Molotov cocktail is? It's a glass bottle filled with petrol and some burning rag, and they use them in warfare also, or like in the Middle East, they have no weapons, so they get bottles full of fuel and throw that, and it burns obviously. So I had this occasion. Somebody threw a Molotov cocktail at the front door. It had kind of splashed on the door, and it was starting to burn it. So we put the fire out. So for some reason or other, I thought the guy, whoever had done it, I assumed it was a guy, whoever had done it, I thought maybe they'll come back the next night. So what I did was I left the door partly open, and I was sleeping in my sleeping bag just behind the door. And sure enough, same thing happened the second night. I heard the crash. The door was already open, and I ran out. And I made a mistake actually, because I should have caught the guy. He was running down the road, but I got caught between, should I put the fire out or should I chase after the guy? That hesitancy, he got away, but it never happened again, at least at the temple. So that was one occasion. In 1974, Prabhupada came for Rath Yatra, and he was there for a week in the end of June. And we were building the Rath cart. I was the construction in chief, and we were getting close to the Rath Yatra day. So the devotees were sleeping outside on the wrath carts, and we used the canopies to cover ourselves over. And June in Melbourne is like midwinter, because it's opposite. And it was really cold, so the devotees were kind of bundled up, a couple of devotees on each chariot, and we brought the canopies and covered up with that. So I was sleeping in a van, at the roadside next to the construction site, and it was a dead-end road. Our landlord, where we were living, he had this open land, so he said, "Why do you build your chariots there?" So that was nice. So in the middle of the night, we're all asleep on the wrath carts and in the van, and then I suddenly hear one of the girls shouting out, "Hari Sauri, Hari Sauri, the chariots are on fire." So whilst we were sleeping, whoever it was, they'd snuck onto the site and they'd gotten these, what they call fire starters, that look like bits of wood, and they help catch fire easily when you're making a fire in your house. So they'd set bundles of firelighters on all the chariots, knowing that our devotees were sleeping there. It was very serious, and then they ran off. So this girl woke up whilst they were doing it, and she yelled for me. I jumped out the van, and I saw there was a vehicle parked at the end of the road. And when we came out onto the road, they raced off in the van. So they put the firelighters there, and then come back again to see what damage they'd caused. So fortunately, they used kerosene instead of petrol. They made a mistake, so it didn't catch. So we were able to put the fire out quite easily. But that's the kind of things that were going on. And then 1978, 79, 80, around that time, we got the Melbourne Temple. It's quite a affluent area where we are, South Melbourne. And the guy, there was, again, a laneway at the back of the temple that we used regularly. So the guy living on the other side of the laneway, he hated the sight of us. He couldn't stand it. The Hare Krishnas, moved into the area. And he was such a fanatic that when they had the local elections for new council, he put himself up as to be voted in as a councillor, and his only platform, his own manifesto was, "If you put me in as a councillor, I'll get rid of the Hare Krishnas." Yeah. So of course he lost. He didn't get voted in because our neighbours actually liked us. It was just him. And so he actually sold his house and moved out of the district because he couldn't tolerate being near the devotees. But in the build-up to the elections, one night I was sleeping I had a small room. I was a sannyasi at that time, so I had a small room. And it was like halfway up the stairs to the Brahmachari ashram. So about midnight, all of a sudden I hear this bang, and then the screeching of tires, somebody, hoofing it on the vehicle. So I had no idea what it was, but it was loud. So I jumped up. Everybody else was still asleep. I went out to the front, on the front wall and on the front road. I was looking at the buildings. I couldn't see anything wrong. So I went back to sleep. But then in the morning, about 5 o'clock, after Mangalarati, when the girls went in to clean Prabhupada's room, they saw that the whole front window, which was stained glass, was smashed in. And there were pellets up in the roof, in the ceiling. So these guys had taken a shotgun. They saw that Prabhupada's rooms, which were on the first floor, there was a light there. So I think that they assumed that somebody was in there. And so they picked that for the target. Of course, Prabhupada wasn't there. But it did some damage. It blew in all the windows. And there was one gentleman that was kind of friendly with a lot of the local councillors. He was a Jewish rabbi, and he was very friendly with us. He really liked us. We had principles, and he was this religious man himself. And he used to give us information about what the council were planning. to get rid of the Hare Krishnas. And he said, I'll stand in support of you. So we used to call him Rabbi Vidura, because, right, Vidura was the one that, find out what was going on and tell the Kurus or tell the Pandavas what to expect. So we used to call him Rabbi Vidura. And he was a big help. But that night that they blew in the windows in the temple, they went from our place to his home, and they blew in the windows in his home as well. They shot the lock off the door or something. So, I mean, there were so many incidents like that in the early days. That was the beginning, and there are many places around the world where they had similar experiences. In New Vrindavan, Kirtanananda Maharaj, he was actually there. Some gang of bikers or something came. They got all the devotees together. They gave a shovel to Kirtanananda Maharaj and told him, now dig your own grave. So he was shoveling. Something happened, they ran away. But after that, Prabhupada said you should have always some weapons there. In America, everybody's got weapons. So you should keep some weapons and train up some of the devotees to be chatris so they can protect the area. So, things were not easy sometimes because we were young. So we had a lot of fun, especially with the cops and the council, running in and out and chasing us. Sometimes Square Jaw would come out on the main shopping street. We'd have 4 or 5 distributors there, and he would take their names, and if they were already in his book, he had the right to have us arrested by the police. So our strategy was that if the police chased us in the street, we should run out in the middle of the road, when the main traffic is, and make the cops run out after us. And then when the cops grabbed hold of us, we would throw ourselves on the ground and, oh, my arm. And the cops would get completely embarrassed. And the public was always in our favor. They'd be shouting, leave them alone. They're nice people. So after a while, they stopped doing it because they just got so embarrassed by it. Why are you persecuting, people for singing and dancing in the streets? There was a case in Sydney in the early days also. They tried their best to get rid of us, get us off the street, but we kept coming back and coming back. So they adopted a new tactic. One was that we would have a small chanting party going up and down the main street. So originally we would stand in one place, but the office workers were there 6 hours a day. They'd be hearing the Hare Krishna mantra being sung by the devotees down on the ground because we stayed in one place, we didn't move around. So they would get annoyed and call the cops, can't you do something about this? A funny incident happened a few years ago. This lady came to the temple. She said, when you guys first started coming out on the street, I used to work in one of the offices, next to where you were chanting, and I'd hear it all day. It would drive me mad, hearing this mantra. But then she said, now I understand it and I appreciate it. And that hearing of that mantra in the early days brought her gradually to the temple. Anyway, when we used to go out, there was one policeman who was, a real demon. And if he was on duty, and as soon as he heard the Hare Krishnas were on the street, then he'd come racing around with a couple of other cops, and they'd try and arrest us. So what we used to do was we would line up single file in front of like a big store like Woolworths or Myers, or there were lots of big posh shops. We'd line up across the front and we'd start chanting. After 5 minutes, we'd see the Black Mariah, the police truck, would come flying around the corner, and we would wait until the last minute to see whether they were just going past or whether they were going to stop. Usually they stopped because this guy wanted to get us. As soon as the cops jumped out the van, we would run for it. So we'd run inside the big stores, or we'd run through the traffic, and the cops, they'd try and catch one or two. There was a devotee called Dwaipayana, and he used to play the guitar. So on Sankirtan, of course, when you're running from the cops, it was a bit awkward with the guitar or the madanga players also. So the cops would capture one or two devotees, and then the rest of us would go someplace else and keep on chanting. So after a while, they got tired of doing that. I think this cop got transferred somewhere else. So we were still chanting on the street, but we had like a smaller party, and we keep moving. So we go down the full length of the main road and back again. And as long as you weren't outside somebody's shop window or an office for hours and hours, nobody was complaining. But by that time, the city authorities, they'd had meetings about what to do with the Hare Krishnas and how to get rid of them. So they made a strategy. So every day when we went out, the council officers would come, 2 of them. And, they were friendly. How are you doing today, boys? And then, we'd stop and they'd say, all right, what's your name? So one of them had a notebook and he would record down the person's name, Samsara, Prasadam Das, all these names, right? And the other guy, he had a camera, and he'd use the camera, he'd take a photograph. This is Prasadam Das. This is Samsara, like that. And they were building up a case, and the intention was that when they got sufficient evidence, they would present that, take us to court, and have us banned from the streets. They were photographing to show that we were obstructing people on the street. That was the charge. So we didn't care. We had been, we had been in touch with Srila Prabhupada, and Charudas, he was the temple president. He had asked Prabhupada, what should we do? Because, we're getting all these fines every day. We're getting harassed by the police. They're dragging us away, etc., etc. So should we hire a lawyer? If we get a lawyer to defend our position in court, then it would cost at least $1,000. And in those days, we were 3 months behind with the rent. What to speak about having $1,000? That was an imagination. So he asked Prabhupada, what strategy, what should we do? So Prabhupada wrote back, and he said that, he cited London where that same thing was going on. The police were arresting every day. So Prabhupada said, you just go on with your Sankirtan activities regardless of the authorities. So just like in London, after some time of arresting, they became embarrassed by that, the public, and so they stopped. So he said, similarly with you, you just keep on chanting. We're not going to stop. And then at the end of his letter, then he said that you should know that chanting in the temple, or chanting on the street, or chanting in jail, it's all the same thing. A devotee can chant anywhere and be happy. So he told us, don't spend any money on big lawyers, as he said. Just keep on going with your Sankirtan activities as you have been doing. So we took that to heart. So they were booking us every day, but we would just continue going out in Sankirtan and not worry about it. Then the case finally, the big case, came to court. And it turned out that I guess he's a magistrate, judge, immediately he saw that, these charges. He said, so where is this Prasadam Das? Where is this Samsara? Do you even know whether they're living in Sydney anymore? He said, where do they live? You have no addresses for them, no identification. He said, for all I know, Samsara might have left Sydney and gone to Melbourne. So, he found all the, deficiencies in their presentation. We didn't even bother going to defend ourselves because we were busy doing Sankirtan. And they lost. The council, and so some newspaper guy, he calculated that the council had spent over $10,000, with wages and so many other things and lawyers, only to go to court and lose. So after that, they stopped harassing us. And the judge added at the end of his comments, he said, why not allow them to chant and dance in the streets? I think they add a lot of colour to the city. So he's seen us, on the street and obviously liked us. So when the case came to him, he just dismissed the whole thing. So anyway, we had a lot of fun. Yeah, there was a lot of enthusiasm. We were only 20, 21 years old. So we had that youthful resilience, and the willingness to do anything for Prabhupada. Yeah. So some of it was not good, obviously, with stealing the flowers and the wood, etc. But we were doing it for Krishna, so we just felt that this was authorized. So Prabhupada was generally very happy. He came to Australia every year for 6 years, spend a week with the devotees there. Okay, so it's getting late, 10 to 9. Does anybody have any questions or comments? Yes, Prabhu.
How should we chant japa properly?
Just by hearing the sound. There's a letter one devotee wrote to Prabhupada that when I'm chanting, should we be thinking about, a particular form of Krishna or about his activities, etc. Prabhupada said no. He said that's artificial. He said you just chant the Hare Krishna mantra and listen to the sound of the mantra, and then gradually he'll reveal himself to you. So that's generally the right way to do it. You just hear the sound vibration, you don't have to do anything else. Where are you from?
Russia.
Okay, very good. Moscow or?
Nizhny Novgorod. Nizhny Novgorod.
Okay, whatever. How long have you been here?
2 weeks.
Okay, are you staying or are you just a visitor?
Now I'm staying in the ashram.
Good man, very nice.
Mayapur International School, how many years?
For 5 years.
5 years.
Okay, I was just trying to think that I had a vague remembrance of your face. Anyway, it's nice that you've come down here. Very nice community. And any other questions? Comments?
During those early days, what was the general schedule when you joined the movement? What was the program? You said some 6 hours, 7 hours of Harina. What's the you have any special morning program and then you go? Just want to know about that.
Well, in the very early days, we'd have up to like 15 or 20 devotees in one spot, just chanting all day. Or we'd chant for like 2 or 3 hours, go back to the temple and take lunch prasadam, and then come back and do another 2 or 3 hours in the early evening. So we did that for a while. What was the other part of your question?
Yeah. That's what I want to know. What was the holy program?
Yeah, well, what happened because of the harassment, we stopped going out as a group. And what we did was we had pairs of devotees that would stand on each street corner, like two. One would be playing the kartals and chanting, the other one was selling back to Godheads. But that didn't last very long because the cops, would come and capture us. So eventually we worked it out that we have a small party and we keep moving. And as long as we were moving, they couldn't really complain about that. Because the court cases were still going on. But the arrests on the street, that stopped. And then gradually the council just gave up. They realized it was a waste of time, that we were not going to go away. So they just left us alone. In Melbourne, it went on for a lot longer. In Sydney, we had about a year of it. But in Melbourne, I think it went on for about 5-6 years. They would come out regularly and arrest all the devotees and harass us like anything. After Square Jaw retired, then we thought, okay, we'll get a bit of relief, because he was a complete fanatic and he was there every day looking for us. But the guy that replaced him was twice as bad. He was a really nasty piece of work, and he enjoyed, arresting us and seeing us get taken to court. So you had to just tolerate it and keep on going. And another thing that reduced the chanting was book distribution. By about 72, 73, Prabhupada started really pushing for the devotees to distribute his books. So the more that we got into book distribution, then there was a kind of like a conflict in the temple whether we should chant or distribute books. Some devotees, felt that the real essence was chanting. Some of the devotees took it up, no, Prabhupada wants the books to be distributed. So the more book distributors that we had, the less people was available for chanting. So gradually we went from chanting 7 days a week to just doing the weekends. Saturday afternoon, Sundays. So that way book distribution kind of eclipsed the chanting. But they still go out. I've seen, at least in Sydney, they're out every week, chanting and dancing. And people like it. They really respect it. We've kind of lasted a long time, so they respect it. I once actually, when I was in Perth, myself and Dwaypayana, we had gone there to open a new temple. And then as soon as we got in the shopping areas in Perth to sell books, the same thing, we started getting harassed. And what happened? Oh, there's a point that I was going to make. Now it's gone out of my head. All right, I'll have to leave that one till later. I was going to say something about the Sankirtan in Perth. It's gone. All right, other question. Any other questions? No? Okay, it's nothing. Yes?
But I meant like, should we walk or sit down when we chant?
Either way, as long as you don't fall asleep. Yeah. We had a devotee in Melbourne. He had some horrible drug experiences and his brain didn't used to work properly, but he wanted to be a devotee. And we had a tiny temple at that time in Melbourne, and we'd all sit, on the walls. And this devotee, Shangana, he had a habit of falling asleep whilst he was standing up. So he would be chanting and then he'd fall asleep. And one time he was walking up and down, Madhavisa Swami had come into the temple room and was sitting there, and Shangana had his eyes closed. He was sleepwalking with the chaplet, and he walked straight into Madhavisa Swami, went straight over the top of it. So that's not the way to chant. Sometimes it was the duty of the temple commander, to make sure everybody was awake while they were chanting. And we'd walk around the temple room, and if somebody was sitting there and starting to nod off, we'd walk up and tap them on the head with your bead bag, wake up. So, whatever's suitable, any situation where you are, you can chant Hare Krishna, there's no problem. No hard and fast rules, as they say. Whatever, enables you to do your chanting nicely. The main thing with chanting is hearing the sound vibration. That will purify. Yeah. But whether you're, sitting up in a tree or... we had a devotee, what was his name? Sharma. He was a black American devotee from somewhere in America. He went to Nairobi, I think it was. So he was preaching there for some time. But some of the devotees were not behaving properly, and that disturbed him. So he left Africa and he came to India. And he came to see Srila Prabhupada. And all he wanted to do was just chant. He got this thing that if I just chant, I can control my mind and I'm not going to do anything else. So Prabhupada was reluctant to give him an endorsement for that program. He preferred devotees to be out preaching. But because this boy was disturbed and was pushing him very hard, that he wanted to just sit down in Mayapur and chant Hare Krishna and make that his service. So Prabhupada allowed him, all right, you can go. So that was like September of 75. And Prabhupada went to Mayapur in January of 76, or a few months later. And this boy was still there, Sharma, and he was chanting 150 rounds a day. and he was living out at at that time we had a Goshala, but it was very small, and there was like a bamboo forest next to it, or bamboo and bananas. So he was chanting 150 rounds a day. And after Prabhupada arrived, after a couple of days, he came to see him, and he asked Prabhupada if he could build a tree hut, right, a hut up in the trees. And Prabhupada said, why? And he said, well, I'm chanting, but so many people are coming now to see me chanting, they're disturbing me. If I have a tree hut, I can stay aloof from everything, and then nobody will disturb me. So Prabhupada told him, this is not good. He said, just do your chanting and live peacefully. So after another couple of weeks, Shyama came back again. And this time now he wanted to get permission from Prabhupada to go to Radhakund and just chant Hare Krishna at Radhakund. So Prabhupada's response was very negative, and he told him that he said, first you wanted to live in a tree, now you want to go to Radhakund. He said, that means that your mind is disturbed, is not peaceful. And without being peaceful, you cannot chant so many rounds. Your mind will jump here and there. So he said, actually, you're not qualified for Nirjana Bhajan. Nirjana Bhajan is the stage where you get, usually when you're older, where you stop all activities and just chant Hare Krishna. So Prabhupada told him, you're not fit to chant 150 rounds a day. He said Haridas Thakur, he was chanting 3 lakhs of names every day. He was living in a cave with a huge snake. So he didn't care. He was not really even aware of the snake. He was into his chanting. But there was a problem for the villagers that they used to come out sometimes and get his blessings, but they daren't come near because the snake was there. We all know that story. So Krishna, within the heart of the snake, directed him to leave that cave, so Haridas Thakur would be able to chant, and the villagers would be able to get benefit from his association. So Prabhupada several times had devotees like Shyama who wanted to just chant. But the fact is that we weren't fit for that, and Prabhupada would always tell us that. Just do the standard and go and preach. So the second time after he had met with Prabhupada, and Prabhupada had been very frank with him that you're not fit, your mind is not peaceful, so you can't chant like this. You should go back and do some preaching. That will qualify you after you've preached enough and, distribute books or whatever and chant it. Then you get the ability to sit down in one place and do nothing but chanting, but not now. So he decided to go back to Africa and preach, and that was told to Prabhupada, and Prabhupada was very happy about that. There was another devotee that had gone to Mayapur at the same time. His name was Odalomi. So sometime in 1975, he got some illness, and some doctor, looked at him and told him, you've got a terminal illness. You're not going to live very much longer, maybe 2 or 3 months. So, although he was married and he had kids, he went to Prabhupada. He said, the doctor says I'm going to die in 2 or 3 months. I want permission to go to Mayapur and just sit there and leave my body chanting Hare Krishna in the Dham. So again, Prabhupada was not very favourable about that, because he was pushing and he could see that he was determined to do it. So then Prabhupada relented and let him go. So that was in mid-1975. We got to Mayapur in 76, mid-January, and when Prabhupada arrived, he asked the devotees, so where is our Odalomi Maharaj? Oh, actually, I forgot one thing. Prabhupada actually formally initiated him as a Babaji. He was the only ISKCON devotee that was ever given officially Babaji initiation. So Prabhupada facilitated him to some extent. But when he got there in January the following year, and he asked, so where is Odalomi Maharaj? And the devotees had to tell him, well, when he came to Mayapur, after some time he went to see another doctor, and that doctor told him that, no, you're not going to die so fast. So as soon as he heard that, he'd gone. That was it. No more Mayapur, no more chanting. They said he went back to America, and the last that somebody had seen him, he was off the West Coast surfing. So this is our Babaji. And he went back to surfing. So what that means is that you can't do it artificially. Yeah, you can chant a lot of rounds, but Prabhupada said if you just sit in one place chanting or trying to chant, it's just for name and fame and show. That's all. Bhaktivedanta Thakur, he's written a poem about that. Kali Chala. So Prabhupada said they're just doing it out of show, but secretly they're thinking of women and money. So as soon as any opportunity comes, they're gone. Like that. So he didn't like the devotees making up their own program and chanting huge amounts of, japa, which they could never, continue with for a long period of time. He was much more happy chanting 16 rounds, that's doable. Do some active service in the temple, and Krishna will be pleased by that. So that was Prabhupada's formula. Initially, actually, in 26 Second Avenue, when Prabhupada did his first initiations, that was Janmashtami in September of '66. So Prabhupada, he had the devotees go out and make a japamala. You couldn't buy japamala off in the store, obviously, not like in India. So they had to buy individual beads and string them together. And they had the initiation ceremony. And after a day or two, and Prabhupada told them, now you chant 64 rounds. That's the standard. So after a couple of days, they came to see Prabhupada. They said, Swamiji, it's just too much chanting. We just can't do 64 rounds. It takes so long. And, their minds were not steady. So Prabhupada said, all right, do 32. So then again, after a day or two, they came back to Prabhupada, Swamiji, we just can't chant so much. So then Prabhupada said, all right, 16, but that's it. That's the minimum, 16 rounds. So some years ago, I was talking with Brahmananda Swami in Vrindavan, and I mentioned this about the 32, 64, 32, 16, and Brahmananda, because he was one of those devotees, so he said, I asked Prabhupada the same question, why did you reduce the number of rounds? So he said, Prabhupada said, I was experimenting. So that was his reply, I was experimenting. So he was seeing what the Westerners were capable of doing. He knew the background that we were coming from, very disturbed Kali Yuga atmosphere, no culture, not like in India, you've still got some culture. But in the West, there's no spiritual culture at all. So Prabhupada had to kind of figure out what kind of sadhana we would be able to do. Yeah, and he built around, the activities of the movement as a preaching movement around what his disciples were capable of doing. So that was the 16 rounds episode. All right, we have to finish. Thank you all very much. Srila Prabhupada ki jai.
Sauri Prabhu ki jai.